Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're here at our webinar today to talk about CMMC. As you all know, the rule went live, and we've got a couple of folks on board here to let us know a little bit more about the rule and what it means for you and your business. My name's Karen Vasquez. I am your host today. I'm with C3 Integrated Solutions. I'm joined by our panel of experts and just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We will be sending this presentation, we'll be sending out the recording at the end of the webinar, so you all will be able to have copies of this. We'll also be posting this online on the c3isit.com website. We will try to save some time for Q&A at the end of the session. In the meantime, go ahead and enter any questions that you have in the questions menu. Some of our presenters may be able to answer those as we go along. If we don't get to your questions, then we'll be able to answer those offline. Those are the basic housekeeping items, and now I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Heidorn with C3. He will be our moderator, and he'll get things started with some introductions. Thanks, Ryan.
Awesome, thank you so much, Karen. You hit the next slide for us.
Yeah.
As Karen said, my name is Ryan Heidorn. I'm the CTO here at C3 Integrated Solutions. Super excited to be joined in this conversation today by Amira Armond, president of Kieri Solutions. Kieri is an authorized C3 PAO, which is a third-party CMMC assessor, and Amira is also the vice chair of the C3 PAO Stakeholder Forum. Also today we have Robert Metzger. Bob is the head of the Washington office at Rogers Joseph O'Donnell PC, also co-chair of its Cybersecurity and Privacy Practice Group, and a prominent voice on issues impacting the defense industrial base. Welcome, Amira and Bob.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Next slide, please, Karen. All right, so this is our agenda today. The CMMC proposed rule in 32 CFR was published on December 26th. We have a lot of important items to cover today that kind of cluster around these topic areas. So certainly we'll be covering the 10,000-foot view on what exactly was released in December, and then we'll focus a little bit more tactically on the timeline, meaning what we anticipate in terms of CMMC requirements introduction into contracts. And we're also going to spend some time talking about external service providers. There's some new treatment in the proposed rule on external service providers, which is a group that covers both cloud service providers as well as MSPs and MSSPs. We'll talk about third-party assessments as well as self-assessments under the proposed rule. And then finally, we'll have some time where our panel of experts here can talk about what they see as kind of the key issues and takeaways in the rule as we think about providing comments to DoD on the proposed rule. Next slide. So as I mentioned, for those of us who have been following the evolution of cybersecurity requirements for defense contractors over the years, it was a long time coming, but we finally got the CMMC proposed rule on December 26th. Really, there was a pre-read on the 23rd, so many of us spent much of our holiday break kind of digesting the hundreds of pages that were released, and pleased to bring you some analysis today. Next slide. So although this proposed rule included, several hundred pages of documents, including the rule text itself, the DoD's response to comments that were made during previous rulemaking cycles, assessment guides, regulatory impact analyses, etc., in my view, the basic structure of CMMC program really remains fundamentally unchanged from CMMC 2.0 and is fairly consistent with what we've heard from DoD over the past couple of years. But Bob, could you please give us kind of a sense of the differences in rulemaking? We've talked about 32 CFR, but there's also a parallel rulemaking process. Gets a little confusing, so would love for you to unpack that as well as the impact.
So thank you. Yeah, It does get confusing, and yet the strange thing is that, just as you said, and despite its bulk, what we have in the proposed rule is pretty much what we should expect and should have expected. You know, the architecture remains pretty much the same as we were told to anticipate in November of 2021 when DoD announced CMMC 2.0, and the continued reliance upon the 110 controls of NIST Special Publication 800-171 Rev 2. Well, you know, that's been with us for quite a while, and it's definitely the baseline here. The fundamental premise that companies will be subject to certification assessment as a condition of eligibility to contract with the Department of Defense, that's not new. It's just that now it's being enforced. You know, most of us will recall that back in September 2020, DoD issued an interim final rule and asked for comments, and that included a clause at the DFARS 252.204-7021 that said that DoD could implement a CMMC program that would call for assessment. They decided not to implement that clause, but now they are setting the stage to do just that and to require self-assessments of many companies at level 1 or federal contract information, and many companies at level 1 for federal contract information, and at a very substantial number of companies for level 2, controlled and classified information, or level 3, which is a higher set of security standards. Let's talk a little bit about rulemaking. Ponderous is too kind. But this is a remarkable undertaking. DoD has decided to put many of its contractors through the rigors of a third-party assessment, and it is relying upon a private organization, in this case the Cyber AB, to assess, qualify, train, and accredit the assessors who will be doing the work of a certification assessment. DoD admitted explicitly in the proposed rule that the scale of the challenge, more than 78,000 companies, according to the narrative, are going to be subject to a third-party assessment, and it doesn't have the resources to do that. So it's looking to C3PAOs like Amira and to an organization, the Cyber AB, to accredit those assessors and manage this very large program. So there are essentially two elements to the rulemaking. One is this new part of Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which includes new Part 170, which describes the principles of operation and administration of the CMMC program. And that's what this proposed rule that came out in December is about. Although it says many things about contractors and many things that contractors should read and consider, it actually doesn't itself bind contractors. The way that is done is through another portion of the Code of Federal Regulations at Title 48. It is in Title 48 that we have the Federal Acquisition Regulations, or FAR, and the DFARS, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. So you have to have the combination or synchronization of the Title 32 Part 170 program rules, that's what we get to read in these proposed rules now, and the upcoming revisions to Part 48. It's Part 48 that includes our familiar 7012 rule that requires adequate security using the 110 controls from 171. And it's Part 48 that includes the 7019 rule on self-assessments using a DoD specified methodology, and 7020 that allows DoD to assess your report to SIPRs of your self-assessed score. Well, we're going to see some changes proposed in March, according to the Office of Management and Budget. We're going to see a proposed rule changing some aspects of Part 48, and that makes sense so that we can have an update not just we can have not just the new Title 32 Part 170, but also an update to the legacy Title 48 rules. And it will be important to watch for those carefully and to make sure that we look for areas within Title 48 where we need further improvements than may be proposed.
So I just want to repeat that in terms of timeline, we've got the CMMC proposed rule here in Title 32, but the OMB website is currently scheduling the update for 48 CFR for March 24. Bob, if you had to speculate, would that rulemaking process in Title 48, could it potentially include changes to DFARS clauses like the 7012 clause that we are all familiar with?
It potentially could include such changes, Ryan, and frankly, I hope that it will. There's a particular phrase in the 7012 clause that if you're going to use a cloud service provider, it has to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, and the burden is put on the organization that uses the cloud service to demonstrate the equivalence. This wasn't really well thought through, back 5 or 6 years ago when the phrasing was first produced. And now it's become, anachronistic at best, and arguably a hazard at worst. So I'm hoping that we'll see some phrasing changes to, update the operation of the 7012 clause. Now, it is possible that the Title 48 changes will not only be proposed, but will be proposed again on an interim final basis, meaning that comments will be solicited beginning in March, but the changes will become effective 60 days later, even before the comments are digested, reviewed, and produce a final rule. But it is, although I've been a little too wordy this morning, this is important. It is necessary for the Title 32 and Title 48 rules not only to be synchronized, but for both to be effective, for the whole CMMC program to become operable and legally binding.
So of course, we'll be waiting to see what that rulemaking process yields, but we did get quite a bit of documentation in the rulemaking process that was published as part of Title 32. Amira, I'd love to get your perspective as an assessor on some of the assessment related documentation we got. So we looked at assessment guides, scoping guides, assessor instructions. What do you make of what's been published so far?
Yeah, so the 32 CFR, the way I think of it is it's the how. It's talking about how the DoD plans to roll out the CMMC program. So in addition to the text of the rule itself, which has some important definitions for terms, this is what it means to have a self-assessment. This is what it means to have a certification assessment. It also included quite a few pages of explanations, which had things like, this is why, we're not concerned about the cost of implementation, which is a common thread through all of these CMMC rules, because that was handled back with DFAR 7012. You should be talking about the cost of implementation for this, because this is talking about assessment of your implementation. It's not talking about implementation requirements anymore, right? That was 7 years ago. We also saw that the DoD released draft copies of the CMMC assessment guides, scoping guides, and assessor instructions for things like submitting an assessment result to the DoD. The assessment guides were overall very similar to what we've already seen. Back in, I think, September, there was a leak of the documents, which went out to most of the professionals in the space because they shared it with each other. And the documents have not significantly changed from that leaked version, which we saw months ago. So they're still very similar to CMMC 2.0. One of the major changes is the scoping guide for level 2 says that all security requirements will be assessed against security protection assets, whereas before it said applicable security requirements would be assessed against security protection assets, which is a bit of a difference from precedent and how CMMC assessments for level 2 have been performed, especially by DCMA, by the DoD's own assessment team. They traditionally have just checked to make sure that your security asset, such as your log server or your vulnerability server, does the thing it's supposed to do. It gets logs, it does vulnerability scanning, but they don't check to make sure that those security services are doing all of the 110 requirements to protect themselves. And now it is very clear that the DoD wants security to be just as protected as CUI.
I think that's a very important point, and I know it's elsewhere on our agenda, but I want to jump in for just a second. You know, putting my lawyer hat on for a moment, it's hard for me to find a way that security protection assets fits into any of the categories of CUI that are, you know, in NARA's registry of the different types and subtypes of controlled and classified information. I think I understand pretty well why a DoD would want to protect security protection assets, because you know, those assets, if poorly done, if penetrated, corrupted, or compromised, can wreak havoc across many clients. But to me, it's a bit of a misfit to suddenly decide that these things have to be subject to the assessment process and substance that was intended for controlled and classified information. This is a different kind of service and a different kind of information.
So from my perspective as a cybersecurity practitioner, looking at the risks as I see them, I absolutely agree that there are security services which have wide and potentially disastrous levels of access. SolarWinds, right? People remember the SolarWinds breach. That was an example of a security service where the standard implementation, you would put your admin passwords for every single system on your network into that SolarWinds system. So when that thing got attacked and breached, they would have access to everything on your network, right? Obviously, very high risk, equivalent risk to putting CUI out in public, right? It's just as important to protect that SolarWinds as it is to protect your CUI. However, there are many cases of security protection assets that do not have that level of access, that cannot be used to attack your environment directly. And it's a very large increase in cost and complexity to try and fully secure those things if they're not already secure. For me, I would prefer that there was language in there that said evaluate based on access, right? Evaluate based on risk. Could this asset be used to directly compromise CUI? If yes, then secure it. If no, maybe we don't want to spend a whole lot of money securing it when we're allowing people to give exceptions to contractor risk managed assets, which have the same risk level as, say, a log server, right? They're on the same network, they're right next to each other, lateral compromise is potential. CRMA don't need to be fully secured. Why do we need to fully secure the log server? It seems like an imbalance where they're not considering access and risk. They're just trying to make a hard-edged, yes/no decision. But anyways, the 32 CFR has lots of hows. It talks about the ecosystem, what you have to qualify as an assessor, education and training requirements. It talks about requirements to be the cyber AD. They have to become an accreditation body and get themselves certified. C3PAOs have to be certified by the cyber AD. So lots of good information out there for review. Back to you,
I think we
Ryan.
know when we're talking about regulation or law, what a difference, you know, a subtle change in language can make. You're talking about the difference between applicable requirements and all requirements. I think in summary, and in speaking with both of you, although we have some, call it, you know, individual concerns about aspects of the rule, no real major surprises in here in terms of what we were expecting. So I think a lot of folks now who have been following along are moving into a mindset of, you know, when does this actually go into effect? So if we want to change gears here for a moment, Karen, if you could give me the next slide, I'd love to spend just a moment talking about what the DoD lays out in the proposed rule as a 4-phase implementation plan. One more slide, please, Karen. So this is, you know, an anticipated timeline of when we might see CMMC requirements begin to hit contracts. And if you can read on the screen there, we put some text that comes more or less from the proposed rule verbatim about what those 4 phases look like. I think it's important to note that this timeline starts as of the effective date of that 48 CFR rule. So as Bob mentioned, you know, we could get an interim final rule, we could get a proposed rule that'll have an impact on the when we'll see this start to roll out into contracts. But Amira, could you just walk us through briefly what that phased approach looks like, and specifically the impact that the rulemaking in 48 CFR will have on this timeline?
For sure. So remember that CMMC only becomes enforced when the clauses actually appear in contracts. The clauses will appear in contracts in the form of the DFARS 252-204 7021 clause, most likely. We might also see alterations to the 7012 clause, as Bob mentioned. It's a potential in the rulemaking for the 48 CFR that is ongoing right now. Now, those clauses, particularly the 7021 clause, which is the CMMC DFARS clause, can only be added to contracts when they are new or renewing or entering an option year, right? Those are traditional periods when the contract can be modified and everyone signs and says they agree to it. And that's also when pricing is negotiated. So we need that 48 CFR to go into effect, which, you know, as you can see on the graphic, sometime in mid-2025. We're not really sure when. I would say that there's, you know, potentially a 4-month give or minus to that timeline. So the first thing that we will see, according to what we're reading, is the 7021 clause will be added to new renewing contracts and probably option year contracts. And it will say you need to have a self-assessment entered. And that self-assessment needs to be within the first 6 months perfect for you to qualify to be on this contract. Okay, now we've got this thing called a plan of action milestones, a POAM, which is really complicated in the rule. It's almost complicated to the point of being a distraction. And I'm at the point where it's almost a distraction to talk about it, where you can have a plan of action under these limited conditions, but there's, you know, you have to meet all these conditions and then not for these and all that and the scores, and it gets really crazy. And the bottom line is that there's 2 tests. If you're trying for a POAM, right, if you're not perfect, there's 2 tests. There's a 215 question test, which you have to be perfect on to even qualify for a POAM. Okay, you have to get 215 out of 215 questions correct. That's the assessment objectives for that test. The second test are the things that the DoD doesn't really care about. Those are the 1-pointers, if you guys have been tracking CMMC, and you can flunk that other test for 6 months. And then both tests have to be perfect. Right.
Can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
If you're not done. So, when we talk about the timing, I think the most likely time that the rules are both synchronized and effective would be in the first quarter of 2025. But it could happen earlier. DoD has many reasons to try to accelerate the adjudication of comments to the proposed rule and the finalization of the Title 48 update, so that it makes both rules effective before the election, potentially a month or so. I have considerable doubt that they can do it, but I have considerable understanding as to why I expect them to try. There's something called the Congressional Review Act, and what it says is that when a major regulation such as this is issued, its implementation is actually held back for 60 days for Congress to take a look and consider whether it wishes to override the rule and invalidate it. And if Congress were to pass an override resolution, then that goes to the president, who can accept the override or veto it, in which case the rule would go into effect. It doesn't happen very often, but this is a rule that affects a lot of companies in a lot of states, and the Congressional Review Act shouldn't be neglected. Now, if DoD were to get this thing out, say, on November 1st of 2024, there's a 60-day congressional review period that would expire just before the end of 2024 and in the current Congress. But if it gets the rule out on December 1st of 2024, then the 60-day period would not expire until the next Congress, and that means there would, under the statute, there would be a reset. And the 60-day congressional review period would begin when the next Congress convenes and extend for a couple months into the new administration. I don't know whether they can get it done, but if I were there in the building, so to speak, I'd be trying really hard to get this thing finalized so that it will fulfill the Congressional Review Act obligations and not take any risk of trailing into the new administration. Second, when you look at the timeline, in some respects, it actually appears to be more generous than it actually is. And this is another example of where, despite its length, there are a couple of places, in the rule where just a few words have high impact. This particular, the timeline is at section 170.3. And if I can net it out, what it basically says is that there's a 6-month introductory period where DoD at its discretion can decide to include a self-assessment or a certification assessment into a contract. And then after that, the presumption shifts, and beginning 6 months after the Title 48 rule is effective, then the presumption is that DoD will include the certification requirement. Now that's delayed for 1 more year for options, but for new solicitations, that starts essentially 6 months after the effective date. So, I urge people to take a look at section 170.3 pretty carefully, because you'll see that it isn't such a long rollout or grace period as some of us might have expected. And that ought to figure into your planning as to what you invest and what you do between now and then.
Yep.
I think there's evidence, Bob, within the rule that supports your suggestion that DoD is trying to expedite this, because in one of the response to comments, they state that the DoD plans to be fully implemented by October 1st, 2026, which would slide this whole graph that we have on the screen to the left by a full year, right? But I think one of the key points here too, and I do want to move on to external service providers, is that these 4 phases talk about rollouts to applicable contracts, right? And the definition that we have for applicable in the proposed rule is really to be determined by a DoD, by a as yet unpublished set of policies that they will give to program managers. And we know program managers will also have some discretion in terms of inserting them into other solicitations. But I did note that the proposed rule says DoD has no plans to, essentially advertise a list of which contracts are going to include CMMC first.
So I've taken a look at the, the waiver authority and that phrasing of applicable. I think the expectation should be that most every contract will be applicable. In the numbers that of companies who have CUI who are expected to require a certification assessment or could be allowed a self-assessment, I think there were 77,000 companies expecting to be subject to level 2 certification assessment, and just 4,000 who were going to get just a self-assessment. DoD has made it pretty clear, very clear in the proposed rule that there's no mechanism for companies to ask for a waiver, postponement, or relief. That doesn't mean that they can't try, but there's nothing in the rule. It's also been opaque as to waivers, saying in effect, well, somewhere we'll have waiver authority, but that's in accordance to establish DoD waiver policies, not identified here. There will be discretion for program managers in requiring activities to determine, what level is required as between level 2 and level 3. I do expect, notwithstanding the phrasing of the rule, which is less than clear, that there will be a lot of jockeying in the first year or 2 or 3 for companies to try to persuade a program manager or requiring activity to defer the inclusion of the 7021 clause and to defer the obligation to have a CMMC certification assessment. The argument's going to be made inevitably that either I, the prime, am not ready, or major participants in my supply chain can't do it. Well, I think I have to assume DoD considered those possibilities, and it put out in this proposed rule something that's pretty strict, with little waiver authority and with little forbearance for those who claim they can't do it. And the reason, as Amira has alluded to earlier, is that people should have been satisfying these requirements since December 31st, 2017. And to add just one phrase beyond that, this rule is threat-driven, and that's clear in the narrative that supports the issuance. The threats are worse than in 2017. The damage that can be done from porous DIB security is substantial and important. And that's why we're going to see kind of a higher bar, if you will, and a tougher line. Whether it's too tough and too inflexible is TBD. But for now, this is a pretty demanding obligation that you should have expected to meet, and soon there'll be an enforcement mechanism to obligate you to do so.
So before we move on, there's a couple of things I wanted to touch on because they're very, very important. First off, on each of these phases, they only occur as the contract renews. If you are a company that has one contract, you might have 3 years before the CMMC clause gets entered into your renewing contract, right? It depends on the timing. If you are a company that has 10 contracts or more, you should expect that one of the contracts will be renewed almost immediately, phase 2. And when I read applicable contracts, and when most folks that I've talked to read applicable contracts for phase 2, that means contracts that have CUI in them. Right. It doesn't mean applicable, meaning here's the 3% that we want to apply CMMC to first. It just means applicable. If you've got CUI, guess what? Certification requirement coming in. The lack of ability to POAM, right? You have to have a perfect score. You have to be perfectly implemented as verified by either yourself for the first 6 months or by a third-party assessor after that point, is a cliff implementation. And it's very concerning. And don't get fooled by all the talk about the POAM. You got 6 months in either condition to get yourself right. All right, back to you.
Thanks, Amira. Yeah, just to close that out, I think we see in the proposed rule a requirement to prime contractors to flow these requirements down to their subs, and I would hypothesize that the similar effect to what we saw with the DFAR 7019 clause and the requirement to do a reporting to SPRS will happen namely that prime contractors are going to apply some pressure to their supply chains, right? And so sub-tier contractors might, experience that pressure to sit for an assessment, in advance of themselves seeing a requirement in a contract. So certainly my expectation would be, we've got this notional 4-phase implementation plan, but the actual timeline might be driven by other market factors too. Karen, next slide, please.
By the way,
go ahead, Amira.
If I might hop in, regarding the subcontractors, I did not see anything talking about waivers for individual companies. It was you could either remove the CMMC requirements from the contract as a whole, or you don't, which to me means that if the contract will have the CMMC certification requirement, that extends all the way through the supply chain. And you can't just say this person can't get it, can we still bid? That's not an option. But Rob, is that how you read it as well?
I agree. I mean, the only thing a prime could do, apart from assisting a sub, would be to find ways not to share any CUI with it. And this may encourage the use of enclaves that are managed by primes or approved by primes, so that they can keep necessary subs who otherwise are not able to make a timely and sufficient investment in the security capabilities necessary to pass the full assessment.
Great points. To summarize there, don't sit around thinking you're going to get a waiver. Next slide, please. Let's talk about external service providers. So this is actually a new to the proposed rule concept. I think they call it a CMMC specific term. I view this as overall positive, but I'm reading through the lines a little bit, and I'll kind of caveat why I think so. So this new category of external service providers, or ESPs, includes cloud service providers, the requirements for which we're pretty familiar with from DFAR 7012. But then it has this new kind of notion of ESPs other than CSPs, which one might assume includes MSPs and MSSPs. Now, to date, I think many of us, myself included, have been critical of DoD for having a blind spot in terms of the level to which contractors in the defense industrial base, especially small contractors, rely on MSPs and MSSPs for daily IT tasks, cybersecurity operations, and even compliance support. So I think it's positive to have, some initial treatment of MSPs. But Bob, I'd love to hear you unpack kind of what does the rule say about ESPs in terms of requirements? What do you see as the issues, and what do you think the intent is?
Great question, and I don't want to speak too much because I know both of you have important perspective. So it's interesting that in the narrative that precedes the actual rule itself, there's several provisions that recognize explicitly the importance of ESPs. I'm looking at one page here that says small entities are likely to outsource IT and cybersecurity to an external service provider. And entities other than small are likely to seek consulting or implementation assistance from an ESP to either help them prepare for the assessment technically or participate in the assessment. So, and then in the pricing, as the cost estimates, there's a lot of detail as to how much time will be spent or how much money will be spent on an ESP. But then when you get to the sort of the meat of the rule itself, the coverage of the ESPs is again opaque, and if you're feeling optimistic, you can interpret it in a way that will come out all right. But if you're feeling worrisome, you might find that the rule kind of oversteps and doesn't really give sufficient detail to how ESPs ought to be evaluated. It says that there's a definition of ESP that's external people, technology, or facilities that an organization utilizes for the provision, management of comprehensive IT and cybersecurity services on behalf of an organization. Well, that's probably right, but within that definition, I submit there's 1,000 plus variations of the actual services, functions, and means of service delivery that MSPs provide. I've been told by former MITRE colleagues that more than 80% of the DIB relies upon MSPs and managed security as a service providers. And I don't think the numbers are any less in the commercial space. Most small businesses have found that it's just too difficult to manage their own IT systems, and they get a better deal and better outcome by relying upon an external service provider who leverages their assets and skills across a larger customer base. But they are not all the same. And then the rule goes on to say, well, in the CMMC program, either CUI or security protection data must be processed, stored, or transmitted on the ESP assets to be considered an ESP. Well, I can sort of see the point on both, but it again raises as many questions as it answers. You know, what is processed? If you are helping a company to establish an enclave where the company operates the enclave itself, and the role of the MSP is occasional consultation and brief access under a set of rules to help fix problems or answer help desk calls, is that really processing of the data as the rule contemplates? And going on, key language is in this table 1 to section 170 or just below table 1 to section 171.19. It says that if the organization utilizes an ESP other than a CSP, the ESP must have a CMMC level 2 final certification assessment. Well, I mean, that again homogenizes all ESPs into some sort of notion that they are the same in what they do, the same in how they deliver services, and the same in allocation of responsibilities between the ESP client and the service provider. And it also kind of assumes that, well, if 171 is good enough to govern the security controls of the DoD contractor, well, it must be the right thing to use for ESPs. All of those things could be true some of the time, will not be true some of the time, and we won't be sure some of the time. And this is an area where more work is needed, I think, including work by NIST.
Two specific questions for you, Amira, as you kind of prepare your comments here. You've noted a logical dependency in the rule where MSPs need to be, ESPs other than CSPs will need to be CMMC certified first before contractors themselves can be certified. I'd love to hear more on that. And then also if you have any specific advice from your position as an assessor on how contractors can be preparing now regarding their use of external service providers, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
For sure. So the answer on the first question is yes, the rule says that if you use an external service provider and they store, process, or transmit either CUI or security protection data for your company, then they need to be certified, not self-assessed, certified by a third-party assessor before you either self-assess or get certified yourself. That's problematic from a timeline perspective. But let's talk about strategies. Let's bring that down to an actionable level. So you have a managed services provider, or you have a consultant who's helping you. And if they have servers in their network that they use to manage your computers, maybe they're running patches from their servers into your computers, or maybe they're gathering logs from your stuff into their environments that they can look at it. That puts them in scope according to this rule. And we would need to assess their environment to make sure that they're protecting that security system as though it is CUI, right? Using the same protections that CUI gets protected. So this is our chance as defense contractors to look at your scope and adjust your relationships with your external service providers to limit their exposure unless you are willing to have them be certified, right? So if you don't want your single security consultant to need a CMMC level 2 certification on their personal computer, don't have them do work related to your environment on their personal computer. You can issue them a computer, you can send them a account to your environment so they can come in and do work. But what the CMMC rule is telling us is to be real cautious of any data that has to do with your logs, your configurations, your passwords, vulnerability scans, patching. This could be potentially interpreted to include network diagrams, system security plan. Any of that data leaving your environment potentially will make your service provider need to get their own CMMC certification. So right now, you can change how you do that and tell them to use your environment to do that work if you don't think they're going to be able to pass themselves.
Well, you know, I am pretty familiar with attacks upon cloud managed security as a service and MSPs. I have clients who are all of those, and then at various times I've advised them on how to respond to security issues and events. I certainly support the proposition that managed security services of all kinds, ESPs, you know, should be held to a level of assurance, and it should not be kind of the free range where whatever you do is good enough simply because you're in the market. However, these are extremely important for tens of thousands of participants in the DIB. If not a large majority of those will be subject to the CMMC rule. And the notion that we're going to put them through a certification to be eligible to support their existing or future clients, it's more idealized than realistic. And we don't really have such a mechanism right now. CY certification assessments can be available to companies who are DIB suppliers who have a 7012 and 7021 clause. For the most part, external service providers do not. So there's no way that they can be subject to exactly the same certification assessment as is the organization that hires them. It certainly is possible for the AB, with DoD's oversight, to develop a means for its assessors to review the security of external service external service providers, and they should, because we don't want to be in a situation where companies are forced to kind of fold back inwards and go to on-premises solutions, which have proven to be awfully difficult to secure and accomplish successfully. We don't want that. And we want companies, I think, to have access to competition and best-in-class external service providers. We need to put some fences on to make sure that they are both capable and secure, and the rule really doesn't quite get us there yet. Can it be done? Yes. Has it been done? No.
I think that's a great segue into our next section. Karen, if you could forward us a slide. So if we think about third-party assessments, and specifically the role of the Cyber AB as an accreditation body, one more slide, please, Karen. I would love, and mindful of our time here, if Amira, you could provide a perspective on the role of the Cyber AB, perhaps to provide additional interpretation, if that's within their authority, on some of these issues that Bob just raised.
So I talk with the Cyber AB regularly, both in my role as a authorized C3PAO, as well as the vice chair of the C3PAO stakeholder forum. The Cyber AB has a limited role in regard to interpretation of requirements. We should not be looking at them to provide the clarification we need about external service providers or FIPS or any of the other hard to implement requirements of 800-171. Their role is to ensure the quality of assessments. That means that they have to show that they have a quality management program, right? So for those of you who are ISO 9001 or AS 9000, I think it is 9100, bear with me. you know quality management. You know the level of review and audit and making sure your documentation is precise, right? That people have training, that you're double checking for issues. That is the cyber AB's role in regard to the C3PAOs. The C3PAOs also have to have a very strong quality management program. So we need to show that any assessor that we hire has education and training, right? That we are assessing their abilities, that we're checking on their performance during every assessment. Are they making good decisions? Are they showing up on time? Are there complaints? Anytime we get an appeal, we have to do a review process as an incident and handle it, right, with managerial oversight. None of that has to do with the technical implementation requirements. That's all from a quality and process perspective. How are we doing repeatable good quality assessments that hopefully every C3PAO is consistent? And that's the Cyber AB's job, is to achieve consistency of assessment for all the C3PAOs and all the assessors, so that company A shows up, gets assessed. We could have 10 different C3PAOs assess them. They should all pass or fail the same way for all the C3PAOs. So when you're looking at the Cyber AB for help, that's what you should be looking at, is how are you making C3PAOs better? How are you making consistency of assessment better? Not getting in between the DoD and the requirements, because that's not their role, and the DoD does not, bear with me, but to the best of my knowledge, the DoD does not want the Cyber AB doing that role.
That is a really important point. Thank you. And it does lead us to another area where we might make comments on this rule to make it better. There's a lot of questions of interpretation, implementation, application, and that are raised by the rule and by the standard that it imposes. This table on asset categories and how they are to be reviewed is in the rule, and it definitely raises a lot of question as to which means what or why, and then what do you do? I think Amira is right that DoD does not intend to convey that discretion or decision making through the AB to the assessors, but it does not seem to me that DoD has established a mechanism itself to make those decisions or to inform those stakeholders of just, what of its interpretations and what supports them. We're going to need that, because some of the questions that we've raised just in this 45 or 50 minutes are things which need to get resolved, and there will be 1,000 or 1,000 other such questions, and we need a way to get guidance on how to apply these. Otherwise we'll be, we'll be working with a veil in the murk, in the fog and at night, and that's not a good outcome.
Karen, let's move to the next slide as we conclude here. Just want folks to be aware that this is the time to read and respond to the CMMC program proposed rule. We've unpacked some important issues here today. I think that will impact many folks who will be subject to this regulation when it goes final. So just for everyone's awareness, there is a public comment period that is open now until February 26th. You can go to regulations.gov and search for that long string there at the bottom to find the rule, or Google can probably get you there faster. But now is the time to make your voice heard. Karen, if we could go to the next slide in our final moments here. Bob, would love if you could just give us 2 to 3 minutes of closing comments on some of these issues that you see as key to the program's success.
Well, I continue to see that the issue of what version of 171 applies is a little less hazardous than many see it. I understand that the rule presently says that the company uses the version of 171 in effect at the time it accepts a contract with the clause. And I appreciate that NIST could finalize 171 Rev 3 before the new Title 48 and Title 32 rules are done. But DoD understands all of the apparatus and accompaniment that has been built around Rev 2, including much of the work of the Cyber AB. And so we're not going to have a situation where the finalization of the rule by NIST, a part of the Department of Commerce, suddenly switches the light and causes tens, hundreds, or thousands of companies to have to do many things differently instantly. There will be a period of break-in or phase-in, and they have the authority to do that using what's called class deviation, and I expect that they will. They have said in the proposed rule itself that they are aware of the potential evolution of 171. They've clearly set Rev 2 as the baseline. They've reserved for themselves the right to change that baseline. They could do that even by changing the phrasing in the Title 48 revision. Also, to me, a critical issue, and then I'll cede to others, a really critical issue ultimately is the practicability of this rule for small companies. It's easy to say that 55,000 of 77,000 small businesses will be required to have a CMMC Level 2 certification. We need to be very sure that all or a very high percent of those actually can achieve this in terms of financial, human, and technical resources. And to the extent that though they are relying upon and require the use of ESPs, we do not want to set barriers up that prevent them from using ESPs. We don't want to drive companies out of the DIB because of this rule. We want to secure them. We don't want to prevent innovators from coming into the DIB. We want them to come in appropriately secure. Finally, comments are really important. Asking for things that are completely different than in the proposed rule is a waste, respectfully, of your time. Having your better idea as to what could be done that's much smarter, also a waste of time. But sirens are coming nearby, so apparently I've said the wrong thing. What is needed are constructive comments, not only explaining why you have an objection or concern, but most important, offering concrete suggestions to DoD on what it should do differently.
Thank you, Bob. Karen, if we could advance one more slide, and Amira, I'd love your similar take on key takeaways and for public comment.
For sure. So a big topic is that security protection data. What is security protection data? The rule has two examples, logs and configuration data. And that's all we got right now, is this idea of security protection data, which would make a external service provider need a CMMC Level 2 certification of their own if they have it on their systems. And potentially, though the language is not clear in the rule, if you're using a cloud with security protection data, say you're using a cloud to do antivirus or vulnerability scans for you, that could mean that cloud needs FedRAMP, which is an expansion to the current requirements. Previously, if you used a cloud, you only needed FedRAMP clouds if it had CUI in it. So from an assessor perspective, I honestly don't know how I would assess a managed services provider or an RPO that has security protection data. The scoping guide does not have that information in it. The scoping guide is based on CUI, not security protection data. So I literally I don't know how to assess them. There's no such thing as a security protection data asset in the scoping guide. The POAM thing is a cliff implementation. It's very, very unforgiving. And this is a case where the joint surveillance assessments right now are actually much kinder than the proposed rule. The joint surveillance assessments right now that C3POs are doing, you are allowed to fail any requirement, any number of requirements, and then fix them, and you're good. Right? So unlike the proposed rule, which says you're not allowed to fail 67% of the assessment requirements. If you do, you just have to get a brand new assessment from scratch, start over. The joint surveillance assessments, you can fail anything and then just get reassessed on those things, right? Which is wonderful, right? Instead of doing another 200, 300 hour assessment, which costs you $40,000 or more, you can just get a 3-hour assessment to finish out the little item, right? And there's no restrictions. So joint surveillance assessments currently actually much nicer than the proposed rule is doing. And then, yeah, we've got the rest, but those are my big concerns.
Well, I thank you both, Amira and Bob. We're out of time for today. One closing thought from my end, it seems to me in the proposed rule that the DoD has really gone to great lengths to address previous concerns around cost and burden to contractors. So whether we agree or not, my personal perspective is that responding to the rule with this costs too much and it's hard to do probably will not have a lot of traction. So I appreciate some of the tactical suggestions that you all have made in terms of issues that will make the rule better when it goes final. Thank you again. Karen, back to you.
Thanks all. Really appreciate your time today and all of the really valuable insight that you each offered. Thank you all also to our attendees as well. Wanted to give you guys a heads up on our next webinar, CMMC Proposed Rule Basics. This one will be led by Bill Wooten, who is our Chief Revenue Officer at C3. You'll see some of the topics that he'll be discussing there. It'll take place on February 21st at 1 p.m. I will be sending around a registration link for this webinar as well. You can also go to our website and you'll be able to register there also. And then if you do have any questions, you can head to our website at c3isit.com. You can also contact us, info@c3isit.com. I know that we did run out of time to do live Q&A, but rest assured that all of your questions have been captured and we will do our best to answer them offline. In addition, you'll be getting an email with a link to the webinar recording, which will include obviously both the audio and video, so you'll be able to see some of those slides as well. So thank you again to our speakers, thank you again to our attendees, and wishing everyone a really great rest of their Tuesday afternoon. Thanks all, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Cheers.